Hello, I'm Dr. Scott Crichlow at WVU in the Department of Political Science. I am here today as part of the Mountaineers Votes set of videos that WVU is putting on to try and help people better understand the 2020 election season. And this is going to be a series of votes that kind of capture different parts of the election process. There'll be a video, for example, on simply how to vote. There'll be a video on the Electoral College. And today's voting video will be on why people make the votes that they do and why they choose to go out and vote. And so what we have today are three people at WVU currently. I'm a professor, and I'm here with two of my students who are taking psychological theories of politics right now. And so what we're going to do is have a discussion about why people vote, who they vote for, what kinds of issues can be especially important in 2020 that might be a little bit out of the norm, and kind of big picture what we think these kinds of things would lead us to expect for voting and how to interpret the vote after it occurs. So I would like the students to introduce themselves, please.
Hi, everybody. My name is Stephanie Golden, and I'm a junior here at WVU. I'm double majoring in international studies and political science, and I'm also studying Arabic, and I'm from Berkeley Springs, West Virginia.
Hi, everybody. I'm Alex Dean. I'm a sophomore here at WVU. I'm studying political science as well as Spanish and history, and I am from Morgantown.
Thank you both for being here with us today. What we're going to, again, get into is why people vote and who they vote for, and how that helps us better understand what politics is about in the United States these days. And so, Stephanie, if you would ask the first question, please.
So for our first question, I wanted to ask you, what affects why some people vote and some people do not?
So there is a long-standing literature on why people vote. And we've seen this come out of especially political science, but we see it in other disciplines too, like economics. And people tend to vote based upon a few factors. And one big one, of course, is if they know there's an election. Beyond that, do they think the election matters to them? Do they have a preference between the competing candidates? These might seem very basic points, but if you don't know there's a vote, if you don't really know what it's about, if you don't have very clear understanding of what is going on in terms of different parties or people representing different kinds of views, then you're probably not going to see people go vote. The other side to it as well is that they have to kind of see a certain utility in voting in terms of balancing their time and resources versus other things that they would do. And so you would expect to see people go vote if it's simple, and if it doesn't take standing in line for 6 hours. The other kind of thing that can play into it is that sometimes people look at voting as a self-interested thing, like equation about, do I vote if it takes 6 hours? Well, of course, part of it also is, does a culture of voting exist for you? Do you feel a certain kind of personal pull to go vote that seems important to you as a person, whether or not your vote's going to matter? And there are plenty of people who do just simply go to polls to vote every election because they think it's important to them personally. And so part of it is a kind of a cost-benefit equation, but part of it's a psychological matter. And of course, a lot of it will turn on election administration. Does the state, because all of US elections are organized by states, make it easy to vote or not? And so often we'll see higher voter turnout in places like Colorado, places like Oregon, where you have mail-in voting. It's simple. Your ballot comes to you, you put it back in the mail, you don't have to stand in line. Not shocking that in those circumstances, you would wind up seeing higher voter turnout, whereas in places that have lower voter turnout, you might see systems that make it harder to vote. And so there's been a lot of research, for example, on disparities in terms of racial and ethnic communities, in terms of wait times at the polls. And so, if you live in a Native American community and you don't have many places to go vote, and you have to be there a larger and larger amount of time to go vote, then you might expect communities like that, you'll wind up seeing lower voter turnout. I think that about covers it. Oh, so I should mention one other thing too. If part of it is that you're aware of the elections going on and you think the election matters to you or it matters to people that you care about, this is going to mean that you're going to wind up having differences of people in terms of who goes to vote according to who pays attention and according to what kinds of information networks that they exist in. some people are just by nature more politically interested. Some people by nature more likely to watch the news than watch, whatever kind of game show is on at night. And so part of it really is also on just the people in terms of their daily lives and the information networks that they exist in.
All right. Do you want to move on to the second question?
Sure.
Okay, so is voting and turnout constant across different types of elections?
Short answer is no, very much not. And so why are we having this video series for this election? It's because it's a presidential election. And much like voting, generally speaking, turns on questions tied to, is this an election that's important to me? Am I aware it's going on? Do the candidates seem different? That's more and more the case in these higher level elections in the United States, where it seems that your vote has extreme importance. And people know it's going to happen. And people might know that you can go vote by mail or absentee early or something like that. So the elections, which get a lot of attention and seem really important, people will go vote in. And so, for example, last time for the presidential race, 55% of the people in the United States who were registered to vote went to go vote. For a lot of mayoral elections, which might be in April or August, or people might not even be paying attention to the local races, you might see 10% turnout. And so a key part of the process of voting is being aware and thinking that it matters to you. And that means that people pay a lot of attention and will vote at a lot higher rates when you see things that seem to be really important. And in the US, they tend to kind of interpret that as being presidential races versus local races.
All right. And then if you're ready to move on, I have another question.
Sure.
So who votes for whom? Can you talk a little bit about partisanship, identity, and maybe just discuss it from a psychological point of view?
Sure, I'm going to do that because that's what I do, but not exclusively that. And we're going to save the partisanship issue for the end of this because that really is the most important thing in terms of making your choice to vote. And so I think it's really important to kind of get in depth about why people kind of are so quick to rely upon partisanship as their guiding, star for everything they do in terms of when they're inside the voting booth. But it's not just that. So keep in mind, first and foremost, it's partisanship matters the most. We'll get later on to the why. But basically, it's the psychological identity people have. They feel like they're Republicans. They feel like they're Democrats or a third party. It's something that sort of is part of who you are, and that will be the number one thing that will guide you at the voting booth. But if it was just that, every election would be predictable. And so it's not just that. And you will see people who wind up voting who aren't going to vote always tied to their party. And for presidential elections, we know a few basic things which would make exceptions for parties of driving people's votes. And the number one part of it is what people think about the incumbent. As much as people often would look at the primary races to challenge the incumbent, we know that pretty much that's a lot less important in terms of who people are going to vote for than just kind of what they already think of the person who's already there. People tend to engage in what's called retrospective voting. They look kind of at the past few years and they decide, do I like the way things are going? Do I like the person who's in office? And if the approval rating for the incumbent's high, then you expect people to go away from the party exclusively to vote in ways that would be about approval ratings. And that'll also be tied into the economy. Now, I should say people don't look at the economy for all 4 years of presidential term. That's not the way people tend to look at things, but they do tend to look at it for the election year itself. So when people start paying attention to the presidential race, is the economy going well or not? And so how things are in spring and in summer of presidential election years will be another way in which you might wind up seeing people kind of move away from exclusively voting a party. If you think the economy, is a situation that needs to be addressed, then maybe you wouldn't always go by party. A couple other things to keep in mind about this. One is that people, at least in the US case, and some other countries too, but definitely in the United States, the longer a party's in power, there certainly are voters, at least on the margins, who just want change occasionally. And so if a party is trying to win a third term, like in the 2016 race of Hillary Clinton, people tend to, at least at the margins, not be crazy about the idea of a third term. There tend to be like American voters who do want change at some point. And so it tends to be a little bit harder to win that third term. And the other kind of key thing is those independent voters you hear about a lot when you watch TV. And this is going to be a problem in terms of saying it's all about partisanship, right? Well, maybe not. Because most people who sort of say they're independents aren't really. The majority of independents still lean toward a party. And what you're left with is a subgroup of independents who I guess you would call independent independents. And they can be really important. But the thing is, they tend to be the least aware voters of all. Because typically, if you're paying attention to politics and your politics are informed by your values, you're going to have a pattern that you've established about how you're going to vote. And it's going to take you to some party. The independents tend to be those who pay the least attention. And so what becomes really important is the world they see around them, what they're interpreting as the world around them in the election year. And so with that, I would like us to kind of move on to some questions for you two that are about 2020 specifically. And Steph, let's start with you.
Okay.
So often politics, when it's discussed in the United States in 2020, is all about how politics is covered. That's really about the elections as they're covered on different news channels. And that if you watch this channel, you'll vote this way. And if you watch this other channel, you'll vote that way. Or it's about who's on social media, what takes off on social media, those kinds of things. What do we know about how what people watch affects who they're going to vote for?
Yeah, so I definitely agree with the statement that what people are watching or what they're seeing on social media is impacting their votes, especially in the technologically advanced world that we're living in today. So the first thing that actually comes to my mind is a documentary that I watched recently. It's on Netflix. I'd recommend anybody to watch it. It's called The Social Dilemma. So it actually discusses 3 things that big tech companies are doing that impact voters. So it talks about how they spy on us, they manipulate our news feeds to keep us engaged, and then it deepens our blind spots and our biases by eliminating everything else. So in this documentary, it really personifies this. It through acting, it shows researchers in a lab surrounded by huge screens. And throughout the documentary, there's a model of a human in the middle, and it keeps becoming more and more realistic as they learn more about this person based on their past behaviors, things that they're liking on social media. And I think that this is really dangerous when we apply it to politics. So I would think about it like this. Let's say that you support a certain candidate or a certain political party. So your news feed on social media platforms are going to gradually include more and more articles and information about them. It can even show fake news on your news feed, so you don't know what's true and what's not. And it will continue increasing until you see nothing but your own opinions and preferences. So you're totally isolated from the opposite point of view. So in my opinion, I think that it really fuels close-mindedness. I think that it does create a different reality for each individual person. And I think that it's fueling animosity and polarization in the United States because social media is leading us to believe that our opinions are the only ones that could possibly be true. I think that it's really like killing debate. We're not given the opportunity to learn about opposing views. And I think speaking from a psychological perspective, like what we talk about in class, I think it becomes an us versus them scenario, and it fuels in and out groups because it really is part of human nature. Like we desire to be right. We're naturally naive. We want to prove ourselves to be correct. And I think that social media is just fueling that fire.
Yeah, so basically people wind up looking for things that affirm what they already think, whether they want to or not. And so you wind up kind of in the first place going for information at places where you think you're going to find what you care about, which totally understandable. Why wouldn't people do that? But the way that the world works today is technologically, people are, or you're your phones, et cetera, are keeping track of what you look at. And then you wind up with campaigns and media corporations or whatever, sending you messages that they think you're gonna wanna know. And so more and more and more and more and more, you get the exact same thing in slightly different ways. And it's not just about kind of the nature of one party or one candidate. It's also, this is pretty well advanced, and they can figure out kind of like what kinds of emotions to use and the wording that they send you and that kind of thing. They figure out like what kind of speaker would be appealing to you for this person. And so, yeah, I mean, in the current environment, even when you're trying not to be totally, myopic and blinkered and what you're looking for, we wind up in a tech world, which does just seem to kind of reinforce what we see again and again and again because of just the way that that's structured. So it's a problem. And back in terms of the independents, often like whatever they kind of first look at, they'll get more and more and more of. And and if the two partisans, well, we'll get to polarization like later on. The parties also exist in different media environments. It becomes very hard to even like converse about politics because you're just looking at different things. So, Alex, a big change that so one thing that we've seen a lot of in 2020 especially is a focus on race and politics. Now this isn't obviously entirely new, but if you look back 15, 20 years ago, the George W. Bush years, the Bill Clinton years, it was not so much talked about or sort of seen in the same kind of way, but kind of the position of race and politics changed a lot with President Obama's election. And then even like during that administration, we saw a variety of activities which we've seen similar things with today, like in Ferguson and Baltimore, like the Black Lives Matter protests, concerns of police brutality. In between all there have been the calls to kind of tear down monuments of the Confederacy, things like that. So what we see today is a politics that's very much about race in ways that it didn't used to be. And it's certainly become a huge thing in 2020. What do we know about how kind of like activating racial attitudes is changing the nature of politics today?
Well, a lot of these changes over the past 15, 20 years are from the shifting demographics in our country, because whites who have been at the very big majority for the longest time, their share of the population is dwindling when compared to other minorities. By 2050, 2060 or so, we're going to be a majority minority nation. But what does that mean for 2020? Well, whites, since they are becoming less of a share of the population, this has enabled a lot of whites to tap into an identity of whiteness itself, like how Black people identify as Black in a way like that. And what this means for 2020 is that a lot of these whites that view their whiteness and see, basically these white people are becoming more cognizant of themselves and their environment around them. And I'd like to point out that this shift isn't completely uniform around all whites, because past research has shown that a lot of this shift and increase in white identity is occurring more along rural lines rather than class lines or even lines, partisan lines based off of Democrats and Republicans. And we're seeing a lot more rural whites becoming more, having a greater white identity.
So talking about how it seems to be especially strong in rural communities, but also just seems to be a stronger period, but especially there. Let's clarify for a quick second, like what that means, like what a white identity, what white political identity would mean. Is that the same thing as racial resentment, or is it something else about what politics would look like? And as you mentioned, sort of the countries can become relatively less white overall in terms of population in the decades to come here. So is this about a self kind of thing? Is it about an other kind of thing? Like, is a white identity politics the same thing as like growing racial resentment, or are they sort of different or connected? Or
They're somewhat connected, but not entirely so. Just because you have a heightened white identity doesn't necessarily mean that you have heightened racial resentment. However, it usually doesn't go the opposite way, where you don't have racial resentment. Well, you do have racial resentment if you do have a white identity, but basically, white identity is generally not. White identity is usually.
You got the key point though, there, that it's really about looking at the self, or it's about kind of thinking about the self. And so if it's thinking about the self in racial terms, for some people that will wind up being a racial resentment situation. But other times it'll just be, you're thinking about white people, which would, for, what people are thinking about themselves in that kind of frame. And so that they would therefore then like focus on that frame in a way that wouldn't necessarily exist outside of these general discussions about race. And so it could be tied to racial resentment, but it might not be. I mean, it's just that frame seems much more activated by the politics that we've seen in the last 10 years versus 20 years ago. And that kind of ties into, Steph, my next question for you. Okay. The thing that we've seen in 2020 is that the Trump campaign, and really the Trump for a few years now, has focused on a lot of, on the one hand, kind of like martial, and by that I mean like military symbols, and a lot on sort of US history and kind of classical, traditional US history. And so think about the military parade in DC in 2019. I think about wanting to give his Republican Party convention speech in front of the White House itself, that very, very, very old building. He's talking about like wanting to build this statue garden filled with statues of famous Americans from years ago. What is that kind of focus on a kind of tradition and the focus on kind of a certain traditional take on like masculinity and strength and kind of like on US history? What does that sort of say about the nature of politics in 2020, that's such a big part of the story the Trump campaign's presenting, the political appeal that Trump's trying to get across?
I definitely think that President Trump's approach has been different, at least in anything that I've seen like during my 20 years. But my first thought is that there's a fine line that can be drawn between patriotism and a cult of personality. So in like a traditional sense, a cult of personality is referring to a regime or like a political figure that uses media, spectacles, speeches, patriotism, demonstrations in order to create this perfect image for themselves. And they aim to portray themselves as a hero, and in some countries, even as a deity, a godly figure. So most often, this is found in more authoritarian systems of government. So the two most popular examples that usually come to mind would be Vladimir Putin in Russia or Kim Jong-un in North Korea. So just to like give a little perspective, like for example, in North Korea, a lot of families actually have they've had portraits hanging. Since about the 1940s, it's been a tradition to hang a portrait of the leader in the house. And some families even bow to it. And in some public spaces, you are required to bow. But I want to talk about this from more of like a non-traditional, like more psychological perspective. So something that stands out to me that I think about is several years ago when President Trump was then a candidate. He was running for the 2016 election. He was quoted saying, "I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters." So I think that cult of personality is actually present today, like even in democracies, just in a more non-traditional sense. I think that it's more so about people being willing to defend religious, political, and moral ideals at a great cost. And it's really about when values are being fused with group identity. It's a transition from who am I to who are we. And I think naturally as humans, we do want to belong to a group, but I think this can be dangerous when it results in people blindly following leaders. So I just want to point out also that this is not isolated to like one political party. Like it's not a liberal versus a conservative issue. It can be found anywhere. But two examples that come to my mind in the US would be MAGA fans and then Bernie Sanders followers back during the campaigning for 2016. So basically groups elevate their favored leader mentally through voting and through financial contributions to campaigns, insult opposing candidates and their supporters, and their actions become far more intense when their leader's power is threatened. So a good example of that would be when the Democrats shifted their support in favor of Hillary. Those supporters became more aggressive and more angry. And also, another characteristic of this is ignoring negative behavior from leaders. So I definitely think that is evident in America right now.
So the focus really on just there being one leader, which, as you said, like, but that goes back to the classical era, that sort of politics is about the one person, and like you create almost like in the whole art around the one person, like right down to the flags, for example. On the other side of things, in terms of 2027, one thing we've seen it's been unusual is the Black Lives Matter protests, all summer long, really, or in spring, summer. What do we know in terms of political science about in terms of political behavior, generally speaking? Like, is that going to necessarily affect the 2020 vote, or is that more a matter of kind of people are, passionate and they're going to take on the system, but they're going to do it in different kinds of ways that really aren't going to be tied to voting? I mean, should we expect people who are in the streets this summer to, actually then go to the polls, right now?
I definitely think that the recent protests will lead to increased voter turnout in young people. I think that a lot of the times people don't vote is because they don't feel a personal connection, or they don't feel personally impacted by a lot of the issues that candidates are advocating for. And if you're not passionate or you're not emotionally attached, you're far less likely to show up to the polls. So I think that this movement has really sparked a lot of different emotions in people, and not just people of color, but also advocates that want to stand up or stand by their side. Definitely anger, sadness, confusion, and rightfully so. So I do think that a lot more people in our generation will show up to the polls to stand up for that. And another factor that I think plays into it is back to social media. Most everyone our age is on all social media platforms, and in like the past month, we've seen so many big name celebrities advocating, posting links for people to register to vote, encouraging you to mail in your ballots. And I'm going to use this as like an opportunity to just say like that your vote matters, even if it feels like it doesn't, or if you feel like you're not personally impacted by issues. I think that we can all make a difference. And even when I feel like I'm not being personally affected, I just think about what I want the future to look like and how I can use my vote to make our country the best place possible.
Well, so I think like both those topics reflect how people want getting activated for different kinds of political goals, or different kinds of political values that often we've seen, through the summer's events, people who maybe wouldn't have been especially, seeing a certain kind of politics, especially salient this year, but then they see people like them out trying to make a change, and that makes it more likely that they will carry forward and vote. And because we're going back to the very first part of this, when people think it matters to vote, they'll go vote. When people think there's something on the line and people might wind up having different kinds of preferences and you want to solve that at the polls, that gets them to go vote. And so whether it's the parades for Trump or the protests this summer, both of those kinds of things seem to be the kinds of things which will activate identities and concerns about policy change or policy, just setting policy in one direction or another. All that said, 2020 being an exciting year, to put it mildly. Let's get back to a couple of basic big things we know about politics, and especially since we were just mentioning the very high number of young people who were active this summer politically. Well, actually, I'll just go ahead and dive right into it without asking you to ask me questions. Basically, what do we know about how age affects voting? And this is an important thing to know for 2020 because people at different age groups tend to favor different candidates. And I want to explain for a minute why that's the case, because a lot of people don't really quite get, why it should matter, why the gap should be so big between older Americans and younger Americans. And that sometimes gets, I think, a little confused by a few different competing conversations about it. But I would say, if you want to understand that, number one thing to understand is what I would call cohort effects. And that's why did people start voting when they started voting? Because what we know from the way people act is that arguably politically, the vast majority of them become kind of more like themselves across time. There are a handful of people who change parties, but a lot of people become very much more themselves as they age. And so therefore, what you do originally matters a lot for your political life. And so think about what politics was like in different time periods when you're trying to figure out why people at different ages vote differently. And so for a lot of the oldest Americans, well, their original associations might be things like the Kennedy administration and Medicare and things like of that era, which would be time periods when Democrats won a lot of elections. That was the world that they were raised in. And most of them are going to wind up starting at least as Democrats. If you go down a little bit into the age group, which probably is the most Republican in the country, people who are in their 50s, early 60s, that was the Reagan years. And they were raised in a society that very much focused on individualism, that focused on a certain kind of capitalism, very much shaped by the Cold War, which had major effect in terms of putting words out there like socialism and communism in a very negative context. So the idea here is that depending on when you started in politics, it tends to last. And so why are people your age often voting differently than people your grandparents' age? A lot of it's because the kinds of things that y'all are being raised around or starting your lives in are different. So if so much of the conversation about socialism and communism is about the Cold War, the Berlin Wall fell 31 years ago. It's not a salient matter for people in your generation. And so often when you talk about things that might have a kind of Cold War frame, 20-somethings are just gonna imagine that as talking to aliens. That's not part of the world that they've ever known. And what will 20-somethings have known? They probably, a lot of their first memories would be tied to, political memories would be tied to the financial crash in 2008, or tied to the Forever War if you're in a military family, or tied to people, just generally living in a ton of debt now in a way that was less true for people in their 50s and 60s when they were a similar age. And so a lot of the gap in age is that. Now, it's not just that. I mean, we do know some people do change, obviously. And we know that different people in different regions sometimes vote a little bit differently, tied to the kind of specific cultures of their parts of the world. But a lot of why young people wind up voting a bit differently is that people are raised in different political environments, and they just kind of tend to keep those in place across time. Now, that's the 40-something guy talking about age. Is there anything that either one of you wanted to throw into the mix about why young people might be looking at the world from a different perspective than other Americans?
Well, one reason that young people, especially people born past, like I'd say 2000, look at the world a lot differently is that we were raised in the technological era, and just our entire childhood has been completely different because we grew up with internet from at our fingertips, phones that you can look up anything in like milliseconds. That's really caused our experience to be a lot different from older generations, I'd say.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, often people used to grow up really on their own street. And that's what they knew was what was on their own street or like what was in the surrounding farms or whatever. Now it's with you. It's in your house. It might be in Japan or it might be in Madagascar, but it's in your house. It's on your phone. It's on your computer. And so you wind up with people, in their 20s having a completely different awareness of the world around them that is going to probably lead to different kinds of actions and different kinds of perspectives, which then would be transformed into political action. I don't know, Steph, did you have anything you want to add to that? Or
Actually, yeah. So I agree with Alex for sure about living in a technological era. But one other thing that I would add is looking at it from a gender perspective, actually, because when I think about like my own family, like when my grandmother was my age, she wouldn't have been thinking about politics, or she really wouldn't have been given the opportunity to think about politics. So I think living in this time that we do now, that's literally half of the population, or even more than half, that is now not afraid to speak out, to go out and vote, to advocate for causes. So I definitely think that's a huge difference in this generation.
yeah, I mean, it's been transformative. And to the extent that people have faces that look like them, that people they kind of like relate to in positions of power, that just didn't exist. And some, like depending upon the group, like 10 years ago, for certain groups, 30, 50 years ago, it just wasn't there. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that has completely changed expectations about how politics should go forward. And of course, what people care about in politics too, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Alex, you want to ask me a question about polarization and partisanship?
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about what explains why people associate with a particular party, and why are the two main political parties in the United States so polarized right now, and what does this mean for like our future, really?
Okay, so this is the big one, and that's why I wanted to kind of hold this off for last. What we know about political behavior in terms of voting is people tend to vote most often for their party. So what does that mean in the United States context? Well, that means that really you've got generally two choices, and only two choices. So I want to first do a little tangent about why that's the case. And if you look at the whole scope of the United States history, there have been other parties. There used to be the Whigs, for example. There have been regional parties. There still are small parties in certain states, like the Working Families Party. But generally speaking, the way the United States government is structured is such that two parties wind up being the norm. And in political science, we wind up having all kinds of reasons for this. It's one of those things that's overdetermined, really. But there's a lot of aspects of the US system which make two parties more likely. And so, for example, when you have first past the post election systems like the US has, that just whoever gets the most votes wins, well, then you wind up creating coalitions of groups to get over that next hurdle to get the most votes. Another aspect would be that in the United States, we have a ton more money in politics than most countries that democracies have. And therefore, it's very hard to wind up being competitive with a party that's raising so much more money. Sort of tied to that, given the way our elections are structured, where they're structured individually in every single state, hiring election lawyers in 50 states and all the incredible variation that exists in state law, managing that for a new party getting off the ground is really hard to do. So a thing to think about, like, what was the last time there was a major presidential candidate who didn't come from one of the two parties? It was Ross Perot in 1992, in terms of like that level of support. And what was unique about Ross Perot? Ross Perot was actually a billionaire. And so therefore he could put tons and tons and tons and tons of resources into this race. If you're just talking about individuals nationwide trying to get a party off the ground, there's many, many, many administrative hurdles that make that unlikely. And the traditional thing that happens is that if it's like a regional thing or a state thing, that one of the parties will decide, okay, well, we see you're over there, come be with us. And we'll just kind of create policies, we'll support your people, make sure you become either Republican or Democratic. And so the nature of the US structure, and I also probably should add in presidentialism. Presidentialism does tend to kind of often, it doesn't always, but it frequently kind of pulls into a two-party system. Though it kind of, well, again, that kind of depends on how votes are counted and that sort of thing. So the US has two parties for these structural reasons. And I want to, like, where I'm going to go with this, come back to this at the end, like, there are, especially today, there could be really big problems with having two parties. And so keep in mind, if you don't like two-party system, if you think politics could get improved by not having a two-party system, what you probably want to do is think about changing the structures that we have in our election systems that really push two parties forward. And there's a whole policy literature about how to try and encourage third parties or fourth or fifth parties. But keep in mind that could potentially be the solution. But we do have these two-party systems. And so what is this two-party system? So what does that mean in terms of partisanship? Well, it means that generally there are going to be like clusters of interest groups, clusters of peoples who have different kinds of similar values that will kind of come together eventually as part of one team or the other team. And we're going to kind of go back to that or the other a lot in the next couple minutes. What's happened is that you wind up becoming, usually because of who your parents were, who your friends were, and just the values you grew up with as you matured, deciding that you are more aligned with the Democratic Party, Republican Party. And this really is a very personal thing. It's tied to what you think is important in the world. In terms of the kinds of things that it's associated with, basic things about right and wrong, about focus on the self versus focus on society, kind of concerns about like what really are the threats to me or my family or my friend set. These are whole kind of very strong clusters of core values that guide a lot of your life that people wind up associating themselves with one party or the other party more and more tied to those kinds of things. And these across time, the two parties used to be, and by that I don't mean necessarily all of US history, but go back to say your grandparents' time period, like the 1950s or something like that. There used to be many more cross cuts between the parties. And what I mean by that is that there wasn't agreement inside each party on like what our view of everything is. That on certain things, there'd be Democrats for this and Democrats against this. And certain things there'd be Republicans for this and Republicans against this. But across US political development in the mid-20th century, that became less and less true. And there's a variety of reasons for this. And there's a few issues that kind of moved around. But the biggest one of all were racial issues in the 50s and 60s. And that as the parties became more and more closely aligned one way or the other way on those kind of racial justice, racial equality issues, you saw different things kind of line up politically, with Republicans really moving in one direction, Democrats really moving the other direction. And then that kind of also, because of what that represented in terms of why the parties were moving those different directions, then other like issues wound up being clustered similarly. So lots of things tied to women's rights, for example, lots of things tied to gay rights, lots of things tied to criminal justice reform. The values underneath those kinds of differences of opinion, different perspectives, tended to all fall together. And so you wind up with two parties that more and more were really kind of social identities about different viewpoints on the world. Now, this coincided with some changes in technology and some changes in information sharing, some changes in media. And while this was all unfolding, you wind up suddenly having cable TV and eventually the internet and eventually your phones. And the kind of the nature and style of political conversation changed. And I don't mean to like mean to imply by any means style is unimportant. Style is extremely important because that's about language. It's about kind of how we talk about one another, which then gets transformed into how we view one another. And so the polarization tied to issues gradually, as information changes, as communication changes, becomes polarization on language, on stylistic differences, on views of the other. And so you wound up with not only the parties becoming these clusters that were ever more apart on certain kinds of substantive issues, but they started to talk about each other really differently. In terms of the way people with a science background often talk about it, they focus on Newt Gingrich's election as the minority whip in 1989, or just the whole change you wind up seeing in terms of talk radio in the 1980s and 90s. And you start to hear words like un-American and things like that, which is by no means like a new thing. If you go back to the founding era, the leaders talked about each other terribly, like accused one another of awful, awful things. But the thing was, when they did that, they meant that about John Adams specifically, but they meant that about Thomas Jefferson specifically. What's occurred in a mass politics, a mass democracy situation is that everybody gets wrapped up in that discussion about who is and who's not American. It's not simply about the president or the senator. It's that everybody holds this other view, becomes part of that negative conversation, it's more polarized language. So things were kind of, not great on this front and through the 90s. And then they seem to have gotten even worse in this century, in the last 20 years. And I'm going to reference a book by Mark Hetherington and Weiler called Authoritarianism and Polarization. Because especially in 2020, you wind up hearing people talk about authoritarianism a lot. Why I'm going to reference that book is that book was from 2009. So what I'm about to discuss, like that literature was about the George W. Bush days. It's not about Donald Trump versus Joe Biden kind of days. It's about like a longer standing partisan difference. And so after the parties sorted on these kinds of issues of race, feminism, et cetera, then they sort of stuck. And for a while, it seemed like you had the left party and right party that way. But more and more after a while, what you wound up seeing growing differences on were things like, is it okay for, like, or is police abuse okay? Is there clarity about what's good and evil? Are you certain of the world around you? I think things are really about just basic understandings of the world and kind of, a basic kind of view about tradition versus change. And why I'm bringing this up is like the two parties seem to be moving faster and faster, but when those things apart from one another, not like economic issues, like 15 years ago. And the politics we've seen since then, that seems to become even more true. And so where I'm going to wrap this all back up to the two-party system is, if this is the set of issues that more and more seems to divide the parties, that it's really about things that politics, like legislative laws can't solve, if it's not like about tariff rates, if it's not about where roads go, but it's really about, am I certain that this is the same universe that I'm living in, that you're living in across the street, about kind of good and evil kinds of things, about sort of who should have extreme power versus not. I'm not so sure where that ends politically. And I think it's part of like why politics in 2020 is so tense right now, is people are talking about politics in a much more life or death, good and evil, American, un-American kind of way than used to be the case, because that seems to be what the parties are really divided upon. It's like if partisanship is often about values, the current values are really hard to reconcile into one country. So what happens in the next few years, if that continues, who knows where that takes us. One possible fix to that would be trying to get other parties in the system. And I will say it doesn't matter what those parties would represent. It would just be a way of trying to get the conversation away from these two diametrically opposed poles on really foundational things. Because the more and more partisanship is about our values and our identity and our visions of right and wrong, which get mixed in with how bad or wrong the other side is in a two-party environment, that's a problematic path for a country to go down. And a lot of stuff might not be able to be solved in Congress or whatnot. And yeah, that's a really happy thing to sort of say, to close out our conversation on. But that's why polarization seems so bad right now, is that we've been on a path toward polarization for a while. But a lot of that for a while was kind of substantive differences, which you could like reconcile in committees and whatnot. Now the polarization seems much more personal. It seems much more about really enormous differences in values. And so hopefully moving forward, we figure out some way to make that better, but I guess we'll see. But that seems to be kind of where partisan polarization is these days. That's a lot of me talking. Any reaction to either one of y'all, from either one of y'all about that? And if not,
sure, yeah. I was actually just thinking about this the other day. So back to what you were saying about how it is extremely difficult for a third party to really gain any ground in the US. I think that a lot of times people get frustrated as well because there could be a third party candidate that you really like or that you support even more so than somebody from the Democratic side or the Republican side. But I think oftentimes we feel like if we do cast our vote for that candidate, it kind of feels like you're throwing your vote away because deep down, like they don't have a chance at winning. So you feel, at times, I feel like people think they're choosing the lesser of two evils rather than actually voting for who they want to.
Well, but I will say that that's something that can be solved, like Poli-Sci has shown ways to solve this issue. And so there are multiple states that have on the ballot this year the idea of going to ranked choice voting. Like in Maine already has this, for example, that you can like vote for your first choice, and then you can vote for your second choice, you can vote for your third choice. And so even if you don't think your preferred candidate will win, that would be a positive way of getting people to go to the polls to vote for who they really want to go vote for. Definitely. And they don't feel like their vote's thrown away because they can still pick somebody that they think has a better chance to win that may or may not be right at 2 or 3. But that would be a way to, I think, kind of incentivize people thinking a bit more outside the box and a bit more broadly about like what politics could be. And also be a way to include many voices. I mean, one thing that's another problem with the two-party system is that we have almost 330 million people in the country. The idea that two big parties really accurately represent the views of 330 million people, I would question that. And I think a way to actually get people more involved and more interested in voting and taking part in the political process would be if you gave them more choices. And if people generally might all cluster broadly on the right, but there'd be different kinds of on the right, broadly on the left, be different kinds of on the left. And this would be a way to, ideally, hopefully, at least kind of make the discussion bigger than just my team versus your team, like deathmatch.
Yeah. Like I know, I've heard like several people, I've had several conversations recently about the upcoming election. And I think that the two-party system can even prevent people from going to vote because they get so frustrated because they feel that they don't want to vote for either major option. So then they just decide, well, I'm not going to go vote. So definitely like, I think including more options would bring a lot more people out to vote.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is known actually. I mean, there've been studies on this, that the countries that have this, there's higher voter turnout. And so it'd be a way, I know a lot of Americans are not crazy about the idea of mandatory voting like you have in Australia, which has really high voter turnout. But Australians and Americans don't always see the world from the same points of view. But this would be a way to kind of, sort of say a reason to go to the polls is like somebody you actually like is really on the ballot. And then, yeah, if you want to, and you don't have to make a choice for, person 2 or 3. Some people don't. They just go to vote for who they want to vote for. But this would be a way to sort of show, to exhibit like your civic participation on behalf of your viewpoint, while at the same time giving you the option of also voting for the person that you'll kind of like shrug and go along with.
Yeah.
Did you want to?
I was going to say, I'm personally a big proponent of ranked choice voting, just because I personally think that as our electoral system stands today with our first past the first system, it really doesn't accurately provide viewpoints of Americans from all spheres of life, and it's the parties are really unable to represent all different ideologies across the spectrum. And so I think that by implementing ranked choice voting, we would be able to, as you mentioned before, increase turnout, create more political parties that can better represent people. And I think that it could help refurnish our democracy towards a better future.
And I would encourage anybody who wants to get involved in kind of changing the system to read up on the different kinds of possibilities. There's all kinds, ranked choice voting is getting a lot of attention like right now, but there's other things you could do. And so like one example would be if you go to your state legislature and try to get more multi-member districts. Now, West Virginia is about to get rid of the ones that it has, which personally I view as unfortunate for representation reasons, because often the tradition in West Virginia, it's less so in the current legislature, but frequently that's meant that people have both a Republican delegate and Democratic delegate in Charleston in those districts, or more than one. And like that has all kinds of good things for people in that district because partisans of both types are represented. Another thing you could possibly do would be to think about getting involved. If you actually are about the parties, think about working with your party to sort of decide, okay, how do we decide who's really part of decision making? And you can like argue for things tied to representing different age groups. You could do things tied to representing different kinds of communities. There's whether you're looking at kind of the system as a whole or your party. I mean, there are a lot of election reform ideas that would seem to make it more likely that people would wind up being better represented, more accurately represented, and be more enthusiastic about the process. Any other thoughts?
This is a little unrelated, but I just thought to share it with everybody. So if you are a resident of West Virginia, we are one of the only states in the country where you can actually get your voter registration and be considered unaffiliated. So then in the primary elections, you can choose either a Republican or Democratic ballot. So definitely if you are conflicted or like you don't feel like you identify with one or the other, take advantage of that opportunity because a lot of states don't have that.
That's a really good point. Okay, well, this has been. Okay. Yeah, Alex.
Oh, I was going to say, going back to like ranked choice voting, another way to potentially increase turnout or at least have people feel like their voices could be heard would be moving towards, I can't remember the exact name, but a system where like in France, especially where like they have runoffs, so you have a multitude of candidates and if no one clears a majority, then all but the top two are like swept out. And then you have the top two candidates from the election then run in a second election. And that way people can choose who they want to vote for the first time and feel like that they're voting for the person that they think that best represents them. And then they don't feel like the vote is necessarily getting thrown away. For instance, if like they voted for the Libertarian candidate, the Green Party candidate, or like Reform Party or any of these minor parties, and then once they vote for in the first time, the second time that they vote, they can vote for the person that they slightly like, and this would potentially allow us to increase turnout and allow us also to have better say in our democracy and allow for more political parties.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And again, going back to the very first question, what do you know that actually gets people to vote? If they care, if they think it's going to matter to their lives, if it's worth their time to go vote. And if they don't feel represented, that's going to be like less likely. And if you don't like want to use the example of France, because some Americans don't like that, keep in mind lots of US states have a variety of systems. And so like I grew up in Louisiana and we have that system in Louisiana that you have multiple rounds of voting and you wind up with the possibility of not being constrained by your party and kind of, getting 2 cracks at it basically. Sort of like, you get to vote who you want to in the first round. And then, so it's in a way a different kind of form of ranked choice voting. But it's another one of these possibilities to try and reform the system to make people feel more included, better represented, things like that. And again, this is all state law. So if you're interested in doing things to change the system to make voting more appealing, whether you're interested in your party, if what you're interested in is your state government, contact your local party, people in whichever county you're from. Contact your state delegate. These kinds of things get moved around regularly, and so there's no reason not to try and affect this kind of change if you think it would improve the political system in West Virginia, United States. Well, I really appreciate the two of you being here today, Stephanie and Alex. This has been, Voting Behavior 101 in the Mountaineers Vote series. I did want to make sure to say, if you are in West Virginia, you can still vote through Saturday at the different locations in your various counties. Here in Morgantown, one of the locations is at the Alumni Center, so right on campus. And that's going to be open through Saturday. And still, otherwise, of course, you can go vote on Tuesday. I hope you found this instructive. And, I'd say more so than anything else, please do go vote. But hopefully this has helped you understand some things about the 2020 cycle and, voting behavior more generally. It'll help you interpret why people are doing what they're going to do and where politics is today and going forward in the United States. Have a great day.